When you look at the healthcare landscape today, you will see that the pharmaceutical industry has never been more successful. It's never been more powerful. And yet, public health has never been worse. Those data don't fit. If drugs were the answer, we would be much, much healthier than we are. But it turns out that at the core of modern medicine is an epistemological failure. That's going to be difficult for the interpreters. What I mean is that at the heart of the medical model is the idea of the magic bullet. A bullet that is so specific, so magical, that it will hit the target without causing any ancillary damage. Well, that worked. It worked in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, because at that time, the major causes of illness and death were infections. And it was possible to find magic bullets that would kill the microbe without killing the man. And it suited the requirements of the pharmaceutical industry. They could produce synthetic molecules, which they could patent, and make huge sums of money from. So much money that they have successfully corrupted the regulatory agencies. The FDA in the United States, EFSA in Europe, the TGA in Australia to some extent. And they have corrupted the medical profession as well. Most of the training that doctors receive, and I went through that system, is very much orientated towards drugs and magic bullets. And the post-qualification training that doctors will receive after they leave university is also largely sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. Their post-qualification training exists largely of drug promotional material. So this model worked up to a point, was very successful in treating infections, although it's running out of road now because so many microbes have developed resistance to antibiotics. But it's totally not the right approach to use when you are dealing with the diseases that are important today. Some people call them diseases of modern life. Some people call them diseases of civilization. They're non-communicable, mostly. They're degenerative. They can't be cured. The magic bullets were not the right way to treat them. And they have not treated them. All they can do is treat symptoms. And the reason why they can do nothing more than treat symptoms, they do not address the underlying cause. The underlying cause, we now know very well, is one or more metabolic errors which are directly caused by nutritional problems. That's where the pharmaceutical industry fails. And that's where we win. Because we do know now what the major nutritional and metabolic problems are that are common to almost all the diseases that fill the clinics and the hospitals today. And we have a set of tools, very simple, very cheap compared to the medical model, very safe, that address these issues. The doctors are a little bit like the 6 blind men and the elephant. Perhaps, before I continue, I should ask you, are there any doctors here today? I may sound critical, but I think that those doctors who have studied their medical history understand the nature of the problem that I'm talking about. I understand also that medicine is a difficult profession. It's demanding. I know that you work hard and do the best you can for your patients. But I'm going to try to make the case that you're not necessarily approaching this in the correct way. You are a prisoner of your education, as I used to be. And that is why I want to talk about 6 blind doctors and the elephant. Now, this is an Indian story, a myth, And it's a metaphor. The story goes like this. The elephant comes to town. And the 6 wise men, the blind wise men, they go to investigate the elephant. The first wise man walks up to the elephant and he grasps it by the leg. And he says, "It seems to me that the elephant is very like a tree." The second wise man walks up to the elephant and puts his hands against its stomach. And he said, "No, that can't be right. The elephant is obviously like a wall." The third wise man, the third doctor, walks around to the back of the hospital. He grabs the tail. And he said, "No, the elephant is very like a rope." The fourth doctor goes to the other end of the elephant. He reaches up and touches the tusk. And he says, "You're all wrong, you idiots. The elephant is like a spear." There's 2 more doctors, but I don't have to tell you all about their mistakes. The point is, the way in which we see the world depends very much on what we already know. And that's the model I'm going to try to expand on, to show you where I think modern medicine is going wrong and how I think we can do better. And I think we have to do better. Because despite the enormous financial success of the pharmaceutical industry, despite the rapidly increasing number of pharmaceutical products that are being made available, despite their increasing specificity, we have moved from enzymes to isoforms, from receptors to subsets. We're moving now to sections of DNA. None of it works, because look at what's happening in public health. Now, this is a Rand Corporation study of the numbers of people who have chronic degenerative disease in the United States. A lot of my data refers to the United States because America is, in many ways, the worst country in the world, and not just for health. I know what they did here in 1999. So this is a graph that shows you how the numbers of people who are chronically ill in the United States are increasing at a rate that the healthcare system itself cannot maintain, it cannot keep up with. The demands for healthcare are bankrupting the American medical system. Let's go back to the very first national survey, which was done in the United States in 1935. At that time, they found that 10% of adults had a chronic condition. And the figures are actually difficult to disentangle. The children and adolescents, I say 2%, but I'm actually rounding up. It was probably closer to 1%. Children used to be very healthy, much healthier than they are today. 2000, the numbers of adults who are chronically ill, now it's almost half. 2020, it's almost 2/3. And now you can see how many children have developed a chronic condition. What that means is the numbers of people who are showing the signs of more than one chronic condition are also increasing. In 1935, only 5% of the adult population had more than one chronic disease. Today, it's 27.5. Well, it was 2018. Today, it's 40% of the population. The numbers of Americans who can be demonstrated to be metabolically healthy, it's only 7%. The other 93% of Americans now have metabolic disease. That's a deeply sick society. Let's graph it. Now you can see the direction of travel. From 1936 to 2020, by 2050, the entire population of North America will be sick, chronically sick, requiring chronic treatment. And the numbers of people with multiple diseases are following in parallel. And these, as you doctors know, these patients are difficult to treat, they're difficult to manage, they're expensive, they use a lot of resources. So let's get more specific. Which diseases are increasing? It would be simpler for me to show you a list of those diseases which are not increasing. Because when you look at the trends, you find that almost everything is getting worse. Now this is not a complete list, and you can tell because it's alphabetical. It only goes from A to E. All of these are becoming more common, and it's not just because of increased diagnostic rates. These are genuine increases. And we also see another problem. These are not only becoming more common, we are seeing them occurring in younger and younger groups of patients. And the example that everybody knows is type 2 diabetes. I went to medical school in 1968. I was taught that type 2 diabetes was a disease of old age. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. We were taught, well, you might see it in patients in their 60s or 70s. Now, of course, we see it in their teenagers, in preteens. Depression is occurring on average 16 years earlier than it did in 1950. And because depressive illness is neuroprogressive and a risk factor for dementia, we see the average age of onset of dementia has fallen by a similar amount. Same thing is true for many of these other conditions, apart from those conditions which occur in children. Obviously, it's hard to make a case for saying that they're increasing in younger patients. They're already young patients. But here's one more example, cancer. All of these cancers, gallbladder, colorectal, breast, pancreatic, gastric, I mean, the long, long list, all of these are increasing, particularly in younger patients. And it would be bad enough if that was the whole picture. But that's just A to E. So these are increasing too. We're moving through the alphabet. But we haven't reached the end of the alphabet. That only goes to S for sepsis. Here's a few more. And now I can give you a few clues as to what's going on to create this problem. A toxicologist would say to you that when a herd of animals or a herd of humans starts to become sicker in so many different ways at earlier ages, this is a population that is either being chronically poisoned or it is grotesquely malnourished. I'm going to explain to you that it's a bit of both. But one case that I like to talk about is trauma-induced brain damage. Perhaps the best-known sport that is known to carry a high risk of trauma-associated brain damage is boxing. But in North America, the sport that is most notorious is American football. These overpaid athletes run around the field. They wear helmets and padding. They actually only play for about 70 or 80 seconds per play in a whole game. It's about 25 minutes. The rest of the time is pause and advertisements. But despite all this padding, most of the professional players end up with brain damage. Sometimes it's very severe. Sometimes they're lucky and they don't end up quite so badly. I never played American football, but I did play rugby. Do you know the game of rugby? Okay, it's much more civilized. So we don't wear helmets, we don't wear padding, and we play for 45 minutes, and then there's a break, and you play for another 45 minutes. And when I first saw the American data, I thought, well, what happens to rugby players? Luckily, 2 years ago, a group of scientists at the University of Cardiff in Wales asked the same question. And they looked at a professional Welsh rugby team and measured their cognitive ability and their brain chemistry at the start and at the end of a season. Now, the professional season contains 13 games. And the experimenters found that at the end of the season, every single player showed signs of brain damage. Every single one had lost some degree of cognitive ability. 13 games. So then I started to wonder about myself. I played rugby for 15 years. And I probably played 350, maybe 400 games. I should be a drooling idiot by now. Yeah, I've been called worse. I've been called worse by my colleagues and by my kids on occasion. But how is it that I can still construct a complex sentence? Okay, you have to remember this was a long time ago. And I was made in Scotland. My parents were academics. They were quite poor. And we ate a very simple diet. And we ate a diet which is not so common anymore. No ultra-processed foods. Now I'm going to go back to the whales, the scientists, to talk about the kind of brain damage they had. They found that the rugby players had a kind of brain damage called oxidative phosphorylative neurotoxicity. You don't need to know the details. What you do need to know is that there are 3 compounds in the diet which protect the brain against this kind of toxicity. Omega-3s, polyphenols, prebiotics. That's what I ate when I was a kid. We ate smoked herring a lot. Lots of polyphenols, lots of omega-3s. We ate oats. All Scots people eat oats. We're like horses. Lots of prebiotics. And lots of fruits and vegetables, lots more polyphenols. Very protective. That was the diet everybody used to eat before the food multinational companies swamped the supermarkets and our tables with ultra-processed foods, from which the omega-3s, the polyphenols, and the prebiotics have been removed. We used to be protected by the foods, the diet that we were designed to eat. The modern diet has taken all these protective influences away. And it doesn't matter if you wear helmets or padding. It's only the internal protection that can keep you safe. It's a kind of metaphor for many other diseases. We have become much more vulnerable. We couldn't have been this vulnerable 100 years ago, 500 years ago. Cast your mind back to a time before double glazing, central heating, carpeting, when we were living in the Stone Age. That was a hard, scrabble life. I don't know, think Game of Thrones, if you watch TV. We were hunting, being hunted, fighting, getting knocked down, knocking other people down. We survived because we were eating a diet that supported us, that made us strong, that made us resilient. All of those defenses have gone. I'll give you another example. In the 19th century, which is a period that I've studied intensively, most people worked with their hands. In fact, the bulk of the population, the work that they did was agricultural. And we know exactly how they lived. They would work in the summer and during harvest time from morning till night, while there was light. So they were exposed to a lot of sunshine. We looked at their medical records. No skin cancer. None. We found one case in over 10,000 medical records. They were protected. They were protected by the diets that they ate that provided compounds that migrate into the skin and protect it against ultraviolet, protect it from inflammation, that kill cancer cells. They were eating a natural diet. Our diet has taken those compounds away too, and so we can no longer expose ourselves to very much direct sunlight. We've become vampires. If you eat a traditional diet, it protects you in many ways. Some of them you can see, many of them you can't. But what has happened is that all those levels and layers of protection have been stripped away. We have become incredibly vulnerable. Infection is on the rise too. If we're that malnourished, and I'm going to explain to you how we are malnourished, it's going to affect all of your systems. Your immune system, your central nervous system, everything else. There is a lot of data that suggests that not only are the non-communicable diseases increasing, but so are the infections. So in the United States, we're seeing increases in Bordetella pertussis. So this, for non-medics, this is whooping cough. That seems to be coming back in some areas. We're seeing increases in viral infections, and we're seeing increases in some fungal infections. People say climate change could be a factor. Immune dysfunction, yep, I think that's probably. I think that's probably something that is going on, because we know that a number of environmental components, commensal bacteria, have been taken away from our environment, and as a result, our innate immune systems are not working properly. So we see that more people developing infections in hospitals, and we see what looks like an increase in septicemia or sepsis. So all of these lines of evidence indicate that our immune systems are becoming less effective. The increase in allergies, the huge increase in cancers, the huge increase, enormous increase in autoimmune diseases, these are all telling us the same thing. And that's why I come back to the doctors. Because I think that the way in which medical training is run, we end up with people who are specialists, who know much more than I do. Their knowledge is much deeper, but it's in a specific area. So a cardiologist knows far more about heart disease than I do. The neurologist knows much more about neurological diseases than I do. But they live and work in silos. So cardiologists don't spend much time talking to oncologists. Oncologists don't talk very much to neurogeriatricians. I get to talk to all of them. And I'm hearing the same story from all of them, and I see common elements. They're all dealing with the ears, the tail, the legs. I think I can see the whole elephant. And one of the clues that takes us in the right direction is the increase in what is known as non-alcohol-related fatty liver disease. It has a new name now, but I know the doctors know this, but I don't want to confuse the audience. This is a meta-analysis, large numbers of subjects. And in 1990, about 1 in 5 of the world's population had this relatively mild liver disease. I say relatively mild, but of course, in many cases it progresses, it starts to involve scarring of liver tissue, and then in a significant number of cases it moves towards liver cancers. So this is not something you should take lightly. And you can see that by 2020, this had increased to about 35, 36%, by 2025, 43%, and judging by the current trend, by about 2035, half the world will have this particular liver condition. Why is that important? It's because the liver is like a canary in a coal mine. Can you, does that have an equivalent? It has an equivalent, okay. The liver has to be very resilient. It has to be very good at detoxification and repair. Why? Because everything you eat goes into the stomach, the portal circulation, and then it hits the liver. So the liver is full of detoxifying enzymes, and it has an amazing ability to regenerate itself. So even if 75% of the liver is destroyed or removed, you can regenerate it. But what this is telling you is that despite the liver's capacity for buffering and for self-repair, that is being overwhelmed in more and more people. That really talks to us about food. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that the food, the diet, the lifestyle that we're living is causing all these diseases, it's impairing our immune systems. It's not surprising that it's affecting our central nervous system, which is really in some ways the most complex and the most sensitive piece of machinery in the body. This is another meta-analysis, and what it shows is that since 1950, and if you go all the way through to 2025, we've actually lost an average of 15 IQ points. This was measured using a particular technique, which is a very old and well-established technique. The first time this test was done was in 1894, and by the British Victorian polymath Francis Galton, who some of you may have heard of. And since then, it's been repeated in smaller or larger groups of subjects, hundreds if not thousands of times. So we have a huge database. And it's very clear that we're not as smart as we were in 1950. And it's even more clear that if you go back to 1900, we're considerably more stupid than they were. There was a much higher percentage of geniuses in the population in 1900 than there are now, percentage terms. But another quick way of looking at that is go and read the newspapers or the books that were being printed in 1890, 95, 1900. It's astonishing how complicated they are. Most people today struggle with them. This was done using one measuring technique. Pretty simple. You show people a group of objects on a board or a screen, and they have to pick one, and when they see the one they've been taught to recognize, they then perform an action. They press a button or pull a lever, and it's the time taken between seeing the object and making the action. That's what you're measuring. And you think, well, that's very crude. How can that measure intelligence? Well, it's a very complex action. You have to see something, recognize it, make the internal calculation. You have to process it. Information comes in, it's processed, and then it goes out. It's like putting a dipstick into an engine. You're measuring the oil level. It actually measures IQ quite effectively. And if you use other techniques, you find they are showing the same kind of results. What these people then did was they looked at data that had attempted to measure intelligence in other ways. One of them is mental rotation of a three-dimensional object. And that has slowed as well. The ability to discriminate between fine differences of color, we've lost that too. The ability to construct and understand complex sentences, that has declined as well. We're all becoming less intelligent. You can see that in Washington and Brussels. I mean, I say that as a joke, but it's a tragedy. Anyway, we have recently seen some new studies that have been done, and they show the same decline. It is continuing. And we should be concerned, I think, for our children. But then we have to ask the question, how many children will there actually be? This is another meta-analysis showing something else going wrong. And now it's sperm counts. So here, if you go from 1970 to 2010, there has been approximately a decline in sperm counts of two-thirds, as you can see. And since 2010, some additional work has been done. They're still going down. I'm amazed by the medical profession. There are some brilliant doctors, and then there's some that aren't so brilliant. There are some doctors who, for example, believe that this reduction in sperm counts is caused by tight underwear. First order thinking. It's true, if you heat the testes, sperm production is decreased. But the reality is much more complicated than that. Let's consider what is actually happening inside the testis. Now, the spermatozoa are what we call immunologically privileged. It's hard to explain. The doctors know, and we can, if you're curious, you can ask me later. What that means is that the process of the formation of sperm takes place under conditions of very low-level physiological inflammation. That's actually a part of the process. If you are suffering from chronic inflammatory stress, which we mostly are today, that process is disturbed, and that directly prevents the natural formation of spermatozoa. But there's something else that happens in the testes. The testes do not only produce spermatozoa, they produce testosterone, that wonderful hormone that makes men masculine. Well, testosterone levels are falling too. Men are becoming less masculine, which means that, well, it's changing our personalities, it's changing social structures. This is actually very profound. And it's probably one of the reasons why we see so many children now with gender dysphoria and sexual confusion. Because by a cruel twist of fate, the same diet that causes chronic inflammatory stress and reduces testosterone in males actually causes something called polycystic ovary syndrome in women, which increases their levels of testosterone. So I'm not saying this is the only part of the problem, but I think it would be foolish to say that it is not involved. So we're becoming less fertile, and we're starting to see that at the population level. So this graph shows you reproduction rates. Now, for a population to maintain itself at the current level, you have to have about 2.2 children per couple. That accounts for natural wastage, death, disease, accidents. So that's about there. Most countries are below 2.2 now. Populations are starting to fall. And if you look at the best population predictions that we have, by about 2075, the populations of most countries will have fallen by between 30 and 50%. In fact, maybe more quickly than that, because the excess deaths now occurring in the United States, which are probably attributable to the mandated COVID vaccine rollouts, that seems to account for an additional excess 10% of deaths per year. And if you're familiar with compound mathematics, you will realize that that equates to a fall of about 50% of the population within 11 years, 10 or 11 years. Now the point is, you might think that population reduction is a good idea. That's up to you. If it was planned, maybe. But this is unplanned. It's chaotic. This kind of population decline leads to social implosion. And I don't see a single political figure at all in any country, anywhere, who's even taken this into account. So we have a picture here of very, very widespread chronic degenerative disease affecting the majority, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the population. Now, I see that many of you are still young and beautiful, and you probably think that you don't have chronic degenerative disease. I think you probably do. And the reason why I think that's likely is because all of these diseases develop over decades. And throughout most of that time, they are preclinical. They are not yet causing symptoms. So, for example, you can be losing bone or calcium and magnesium in your bones for 4 or 5 decades before the bone finally breaks, because there is a great deal of redundancy that is built into the system. Same thing is true of coronary artery disease. Teenagers, if they've had a terrible accident, they've been killed on the road, and we cut them open, we see they have fatty streaks in the linings of their coronary arteries. Well, if left to themselves, that will grow slowly, very, very slowly, and 50 years later, it might cause angina pectoris, or 60 years later, it might cause a heart attack, and that first heart attack might kill them. But they've had the disease for half a century. It's been slowly growing underground. And that's true of many of these diseases. The same would be true of dementia, for example. They grow slowly under the surface, like fires smoldering underground for many, many years before they finally emerge, quite late in the disease. And what that means is that once you notice that you have a symptom and go to the doctor, it's very late in the day. The doctor always arrives too late, like a fireman who arrives at the scene of a house fire when the house is already burned halfway to the ground. And when he arrives, he has the wrong tools. He can't cure anything. All he can do is treat the symptoms. What that means is that although you might not have hypertension, you might not have had a heart attack yet, you may still be able to remember where you left your car keys. But under the surface, you probably all have the early stage of these conditions. So as you sit here listening to me, your arteries are slowly filling up with atheroma, your bones are slowly crumbling, and your brain cells are dying one by one. That's the bad news. But the good news is it doesn't have to happen. And we know it doesn't have to happen because we can see that in other populations who do not live in the way that we do. We see this in vestigial groups, people who live in a very old-fashioned way. There are two groups that we study very intensively. Now, one of those are the Hadza. They're hunter-gatherers who live in Tanzania, in Africa. And another group are the Tsimane. They're forager horticulturalists who live in Bolivia, in South America. These people are studied constantly, and they're surrounded by Western scientists. And I think as a result, their way of life is slowly disappearing. But what we see when we look at them is that they age in a very different way. Amongst a population like this, like you, most of you, as I said, have the symptoms of pre-clinical illness. 1 in 5 have liver disease, about a quarter have moving towards osteoporosis, at least a third, and probably far more than that, are moving towards their first heart attack. About a fifth are slowly becoming demented, and almost half are moving towards sarcopenia, which is a very serious condition. But if we go back to the Hadza and the Tsimane, they don't have those problems at all. They don't have damage in the linings of their arteries. Their blood pressure does not increase as they get older. They do not become insulin resistant. In men, the prostate does not grow. In men and in women, the kidneys do not lose their ability to form concentrated urine, which is important. That's one reason why elderly people in the West easily become dehydrated, and dehydration creates a whole new series of risk factors and accelerates the aging process. But perhaps most importantly, in those cultures, men and women as they get older do not show the signs of damage in the brain to the cortices, subcortices, and hypothalamus and hippocampus that we think is normal. And what these people tell us is that everything we think is normal about the aging process today. We think it's normal to have more disease as we get older. It's not. These people don't. We're suffering all of these problems because we're being poisoned. And because more and more of us are being poisoned, as our lifestyle continues to get worse, it is destroying the ability of any nation to provide crisis management health care. It is ridiculous to wait until people get sick and then to try to cover up the damage. We can't afford it. We have reached the end of the road economically. In many countries, hospital systems are going bankrupt. Wards are being closed. Medical treatment is increasingly being rationed. The average cost of a new biological drug in North America is it's over $200,000 a year. Who can afford that? These drugs that don't cure anything. Which is why getting sick in North America is the most common cause of bankruptcy and losing your house and ending up on the street. And then increasingly in the grave. It's a cruel society. It's a stupid society. So let's start looking at the diet. And let's start by analyzing when this started. 1935, things were still pretty good. But by about 1950, you can see things starting to change. So let's see. No, that doesn't show. The solid lines show the numbers of people who are dying of infectious diseases. This is the respiratory tract, but I could show you similar graphs for other tissues. So this would be pneumonia, tuberculosis, influenza, diseases like that. And these are non-communicable diseases, the dotted lines, and they would include chronic obstructive lung disease, lung cancer, serious fatal cases of asthma. And you can see that they start to cross over around about 1950. That's when the non-communicable diseases really take off. So what happened in 1950 to change the health environment? Well, obviously nothing. If something that had been so disastrous happened in 1950 and immediately you saw these changes, the doctors of the day, the scientists, would have identified it. They would have been able to see the problem. What this tells us is, when you know a little bit more about the way in which these diseases are caused, something must have happened about 10, maybe 15 years before. So we need to go back in time to 1940, maybe the late 30s, and that's when we see the introduction of what some people call brown food, and which includes fast food and ultra-processed food. This is what's killing us, and this is not just me who's saying this. These are some of the biggest and the best data crunchers in the world, and they come up with the same result, pretty much consistently. Poor diet is the biggest cause of early death globally. It's not smoking, it's not alcohol, it's not road traffic exercises, it's not even USA foreign policy. It's the food we eat. So let's consider the industrial diet. How does it affect us? We know it affects the way in which our genes are expressed. It doesn't change our genes, but it certainly changes the way in which they operate. And that has a direct effect, as the diet does, on our metabolism, all of our metabolic reactions, which we call the metabolome. Now, this is not yet very helpful, but we can simplify it. If you go to the local food shop, supermarket, if you analyze the number of different compounds that you can find in all of the different foods, it's between 70 and 90,000 different molecules. All of them have slightly different effects on the body, but it's very confusing. When you have so many variables, it's very difficult. Not very meaningful, not very helpful to try to pick out individual compounds. Instead, what we have tried to do is to see whether there were a smaller number of ways in which collectively this could harm us. And it turns out there are four major mechanisms. There are several smaller ones, but these are the important ones. Chronic inflammatory stress, which I know you've heard about. Chronic inflammatory stress leads, at the end of the process, to the slow destruction of healthy tissue, which is one of the hallmarks of chronic degenerative disease. And it is made worse by type B malnutrition. This describes a condition where you are lacking in many of the cofactors that you need to rebuild tissue. Not just the vitamins and the minerals, but a range of phytonutrients and other odd nutrients as well. But we're low in those. So this means more tissue destruction. This means less ability to repair it. And this is what's going on that contributes to the slow destruction of cartilage or bone, arterial tissue, or brain cells. Something else is going on, dysbiosis. The modern diet causes dysbiosis, which means the wrong population of microbes in the intestines. And that leads to many problems, not just in the intestines, but throughout the body. And finally, glycemic mismatch. And that describes a situation where you're eating too many sugars and starches, you're pouring glucose into the bloodstream, and you're not removing enough of it. So it accumulates, and you move through hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, moving towards metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and then the whole aging process becomes accelerated, and you develop an increased risk of many cancers, retinopathies, neuropathies, cardiovascular disease. That's not a good place to be. So we're pouring too much sugar into the bloodstream, which is fine if you're active, but we have also become very inactive. It's not the liver that takes glucose out of the bloodstream. Its capacity is very small. It's actually your skeletal muscle that takes glucose, excess glucose out of the bloodstream, but only if you're using your muscle. If you're sitting on your ass all day, the muscles don't work very well. So a combination of lots of sugars and starches and a sedentary lifestyle. Don't pass go, don't collect $200. Just develop metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. So all of this is made worse by our physically inactive lifestyle, and that also makes this worse. We're eating a lot of foods, junk foods, ultra-processed foods, which have got lots of sugars and starches and plant oils, very little nutritional value. And because we're so inactive, we're eating much less than our ancestors used to eat. So that means that we end up very low, as I said, in all the micronutrients. Now we can talk about antidotes. These are 4 disease mechanisms. We can block each one of them. And when you block them, a lot of those diseases disappear. That's why the Hadza and the Tsimane are so free of these diseases. And that's the kind of freedom of disease that we can achieve by neutralizing these disease-causing impulses which are caused by our diet and lifestyle. So let's talk about inflammation. Well, let's not talk about inflammation. Did I do that? You know, I can talk without the slides, but this particular slide is quite complicated. I wanted to show you how inflammation works, and just describing it to you would be very confusing. Can you wait? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Alcuez. Hey, how are you?
Very good, very good.
How are you, my friend?
Very good.
My Lithuanian friend. I'll tell jokes if you sing. Actually, we don't want to encourage him. Okay. Don't start singing, Andrew, please. I'll have to go to Romania. Okay, the point is that inflammation isn't all bad. Some inflammation is very good, it's very useful. And the reason why it's useful is that if you're attacked by a bacterium or a virus, if you have suffered from trauma, then you need to create what is known as acute inflammation, which kills the bacteria and helps to resolve the trauma. So acute inflammation is very healthy. And in order to create acute inflammation, you need omega-6s, omega-6 fatty acids in the membranes of your cells. That creates the inflammatory sequence. And once the threat has been neutralized, you need omega-3s, also in the cell membrane, to stop the inflammation. Now, the omega-6s and 3s are built into the cell membranes, and the proportion of 6s and 3s in the membrane reflects the proportion of 6s and 3s in your diet. So the 6s drive inflammation, the 3s slow it down. It's like the accelerator and the brake of a car, and obviously you need both. We used to eat 6s and 3s at a ratio of about maybe 2 or 3 or 4 to 1 throughout most of recorded history. The problem is that the food industry has given us foods which are full of omega-6s and very little omega-3s. We now have an average ratio of 6 to 3 of 15 to 1, which means the accelerator is... Oh, thank you. So the accelerator is on all the time, and the brakes aren't working. So the 6s and the 3s, you need to have them in the right proportion. But that's not all you need. I'm going to show you a little bit more about how inflammation works now. All of that is going on inside this cell, which could be an immune cell. So let's say it's a neutrophil. And the 6 to 3 ratio is what is determining what is happening inside this cell. The problem is that the cell talks to other cells. All the cells in your body are talking to almost every other cell. If you could hear the conversations that your cells are having with each other, it would be like listening to the hum and the buzz of the biggest cocktail party you could ever imagine. You know when you go to the concert hall and before the music starts, everyone's talking, you can feel that buzz. 1,000 different conversations taking at the same time. That's how it is inside you, except multiply that by 100, by 1,000 times. All of your cells, everything connects in the body. So these immune cells, one of the things that they're doing is they're sending out little messengers to the other cells. And these are called exosomes. They're little particles that they send out into the intracellular, into the spaces between the cells, and they talk to each other. And these are called exosomes. And if this immune cell is involved in an immune reaction, it is sending out exosomes which are packed with information. including messenger RNA, bits of DNA as well, and enzymes. And one of those enzymes, or one group of enzymes, is called the matrix metalloproteases. And these are very destructive enzymes indeed. They're very destructive. They're involved in attacks against bacteria. They're involved in resolving tissue that's been damaged. But you mustn't have too much of them, because otherwise they will destroy everything. So a healthy diet will give you, first of all, the right ratio of 6s to 3s, so this is under control, but it will also give you significant amounts of polyphenols. And what the polyphenols do is they keep these enzymes under control. So that's a healthy diet. If you have this kind of diet, you can create an acute inflammatory response to, let's say, an infection. You can ward off the infection. But you won't develop chronic inflammation, which we now know is involved in many different diseases. So what has the food industry done? First of all, they've given us a very high 6-to-3 ratio, average 15 to 1. So the first part of the inflammation sequence is overheating. And then the food industry did something else, even worse. They took the polyphenols away, which means that the second part of the inflammatory sequence is overheating. And your cells are releasing large amounts of these enzymes into the tissue all the time, hour after hour, day after day, month after month. Your tissues are gradually dissolving because these enzymes dissolve this. And this is the extracellular matrix, which is a new tissue, relatively newly discovered, probably the most recent organ to be discovered. It's considered to be an organ now. And it's a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers which holds all of your cells together in the right orientation so that they can communicate with each other effectively and coordinate and function collectively. You've heard about collagen. Well, there's about 12 different types of collagen. Some of these fibers are collagen. But there's a lot more than collagen in here. There's over 300 different types of fibers. This is a very specialized organ. There are different proportions of different fibers in different parts of the body because they're all doing different things. But the point is, those enzymes that are being released by your immune cells destroy all of these fibers: collagen, elastin, laminectin, and everything else. And these are the fibers that hold you together. They are the same enzymes that are produced by flesh-eating bacteria. The flesh-eating bacteria are producing large amounts of these enzymes in a short period of time, and they turn you into goulash. They dissolve everything. Muscle, skin, cartilage. They destroy everything. So it is those same enzymes that are being released into your tissues, if you have chronic inflammation, that is destroying you much more slowly over decades, so that after 50 years of this, you have a heart attack, or an osteoporotic fracture, or you become demented. It's very simple. It's just like a very slow version of being infected by a flesh-eating microbe. This is what the food industry, the multinationals, have done to us. They've increased the 6-to-3 ratio. They've taken our polyphenols away for different reasons. And this is one of the main reasons why we are so likely to have chronic inflammatory stress today, and why the degenerative diseases have become so common. So who are doing it? Who are the criminals? Well, you know them. Coca-Cola, Mars, Kellogg's, PepsiCo, Nestle. This group of companies controls the lion's share of all the ultra-processed and packaged foods that are sold in the world. These are the companies you trust and the brands you love. And you love the brands because they're made to be addictive. Deliberately made to be addictive. Now, back in the day, when a food company produced a new selection of foods, they would take an audience like you, and a man like me or a woman would come with a clipboard, and I'd say, which one did you like best? Or you like that one best, and you like this one? And then I would take the figures away, which version had the highest score, and then that's the one we would make. But it doesn't work very well, because people aren't honest. They lie. And they get confused, and they forget. So that data isn't very helpful. So what the food companies use now is a technique called bliss point technology. So I will take you, and I will bring you into my laboratory and put your head inside an MRI scanner. And then I will feed you the different foods, and I can see on the screen, this food makes all the pleasure centers in the brain light up. And I can change the salt content, the sugar content, the fat content, the crunch, the mouthfeel, until I reach what is known as the bliss point. That is the food, the variation, which gives you the most maximal pleasure. And the food industry uses this all the time, and they have succeeded in creating foods which meet all the criteria of addictive substances. And that's why they market so intensively to your children, because they know that if they can encourage your children to develop these eating habits at a young age, they will be their customers for life. And the food companies don't care if they kill you. It's nothing personal, just business. They don't care at all. And I know because I've worked for some of them. None of these foods are acutely toxic. But if you eat too many for too long, they will make you sick and they will kill you because they've taken away the omega-3s, they've taken away the polyphenols. Those are two important protective anti-inflammatory compounds. And then the food industry takes away two more, prebiotics, which I'll talk about later, and beta-glucans. Two more important anti-inflammatory protective compounds, all gone. And they replace them with these, and the doctors will recognize these. They're advanced glycation end products, advanced lipoxidation end products. These are produced quite directly by industrial cooking, which is rather different to domestic cooking. And compounds known as lipopolysaccharides, which are produced in different ways and in different types of foods. These are pro-inflammatory, very pro-inflammatory. So the anti-inflammatories have gone. They've been replaced by pro-inflammatory compounds. No wonder we have so much chronic inflammatory stress. And then the food industry makes everything worse by filling these foods with sugar and salt. So this is a diet that, I should say, for the doctors, when I say salt, I mean sodium. So this is a diet which can only make you ill, and it can only kill you. And I'll show you some figures in a bit to prove that. Causes chronic inflammation, for sure. It causes dysbiosis, and it also causes malnutrition. Now, there's two different kinds of malnutrition. The one we learned about at medical school, which is type A, where you might be deficient in a particular micronutrient, very often low in calories too, and this is what we used to see in the developing nations. But that's not what we see today. We see type B malnutrition, where you're low in everything except calories. Not deficient, but depleted. So again, the medics know this is a different thing from deficiency. Depleted in everything except calories. Well, we're not eating as much food as we used to. And what are the foods that we're eating? Well, this is what the food industry likes to sell us: ultra-processed food, increased added value for them. These are the foods you love to eat. You eat these foods, don't you? Do you deny that? Oh, you're so intelligent. You never eat these foods, do you? You have such good taste. Oh, yeah. And these are the versions that we think are healthier, but when you look at the nutritional composition, they're not really much better. In fact, some of these are more like confectionery. Not a good thing to be feeding your kids. You can resist that, but can you resist this? No, everybody loves ice cream. Of course, you all. Yes. You love ice cream. Okay, this is the ultimate ultra-processed food. All sugar all the time and nothing else, really. There's very little of anything else. This is not a good food to be eating. Okay, you can have a little bit sometimes, but not every day. So we're eating foods which are full of empty calories, and we're not eating enough because we're so physically inactive. May I point out to you that this is not the correct way to walk your dog. And this is not the traditional way of carrying your luggage. Ridiculous examples. But then this, the remote, is a smaller example, which is in all of our houses. You know, it used to be, if you wanted to change the television channel, you'd have to walk all the way to the other side of the room. You had to change the channels by hand. There must be some... Is there anyone here old enough to remember that? Oh, they were dark days, weren't they? Young people, they don't understand how we suffered. Life... Oh, you remember? Life used to be so hard. So in some large ways and in many small ways, our requirements for being physically active have got less. The foods we're eating contain less nutrients, and so when we analyze what people eat, we find almost everybody is low in everything. And what does type B malnutrition look like? It looks like these idiots. They have type B malnutrition. They have dysbiosis. They have chronic inflammation, which is why when we analyze them, we find they already contain in their bodies the early stages, the seeds of the diseases which will eventually become clinically important, which will make them sick and will kill them. And we know that the more ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you die. So with every 10% increase in your intake of ultra-processed foods, you see an increased risk of cancer, diabetes, and early death. And it's dose-related. The more ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you die. We even saw during COVID that if you ate more of these foods, you had more serious COVID and you died more. The reason is you have more chronic inflammation, but you also have dysbiosis. And if you have COVID virus, the virus is multiplying in certain tissues, including inside the intestines. If you have the wrong population of bacteria, the virus multiplies unchecked, so it's going to be much worse. And if you're eating more ultra-processed foods, recently, this is the ELISA Brazil study, it showed that you were more likely to develop cognitive decline and dementia. We also know, and I talked about immunological dysfunction, that when you eat these foods, you are more likely to see the immune system getting old and dysfunctional. You're more likely to develop sepsis and septicemia. Now, this is cheating. I'm cheating. This was not done with humans. It was done with lab rats. Because the foods, ultra-processed foods, taste so delicious that rats prefer them as well. If you offer a rat laboratory chow on one side and cafeteria food on the other, the rats will eat the same ultra-processed foods that we love to eat. And if they do, that's what happens to them. And they die young, just like we do. Now, the United States consumes more ultra-processed food than anywhere else. About 75% of all their calories. Some people would say it's 70, but some data says it's 75%, are in the form of ultra-processed foods. If you eat more ultra-processed foods, I've said you're going to die more. Where is the proof? Here's some more proof. This is an international league table, and it's showing you the average life expectancy. Now, average life expectancy in a nation is a rough guide as to how healthy that country is. The healthier the country, the longer the average lifespan. So this is the United States. Now trace that back, and you can see that in 1950, they were in position 13 in the International League Table. They've fallen to 53rd. Actually, that was in 2020. They're now at position 55. The country that eats the next largest amount of ultra-processed foods is Great Britain. That's this line, 36 now. And we used to be at number 10. We used to be 10th. We're at 36. Actually, we're now 40th. The more ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you die. But there's one line here that's going in the different direction. The green one, that's Japan. What happened there? They developed a category of food called foshu. Now, these are foods which are designed specifically with ingredients which provide health benefits. And look, they were 45 in the International League Table. Now they're consistently in the top 3. Not because they have better doctors, not because they use more drugs or have more hospitals, because they have a healthier diet. It's the easiest, cheapest, kindest way to improve health, not only nationally, but within a town, a village, within your family, within your circle. It's the simplest way of doing it. So let's take an average Serb. What is a typical Serbian name? What is a typical Serbian surname? Oh, Tric? Petrovic. Okay, this is Mr. Petrovic. He's eating ultra-processed foods. So he has no omega-3s, no polyphenols, and lots of inflammation, which shows up in different diseases. And a diet with no prebiotic fibers, so he has dysbiosis, he has inflammation of the intestines. What do we do for him? We don't treat him with drugs, we simply give him balance oil, omega-3s, polyphenols, the inflammation goes away. Then we give him prebiotic fibers in Xenobiotic, and these problems disappear as well. It's very simple, no drugs needed. Very easy to do. So what are probiotic fibers, prebiotic fibers? They're food for probiotics. Can I have 5 more minutes? 10? Okay. Prebiotic fibers feed the probiotics that live inside you. The probiotics produce compounds called postbiotics, and they feed you. The postbiotics stop inflammation, and they kill cancer cells. They're really good compounds. So the more prebiotic fibers you eat, the more green bacteria you have, and the kinder the microbes are to you. These microbes become a part of your defense system. They're helping you. What's happened is that the prebiotic fibers have been taken away by industry, the good bacteria have died, they've been replaced by different bacteria which eat protein, and they destroy the mucus layer which protects your cells, and they come into direct contact with your cells and cause immense inflammation. So much inflammation, these cells start to die, they start to separate. Now you have leaky gut, and poisons from the gut leach into the bloodstream and cause damage to the liver, the heart, the brain, and everywhere else. The solution? Not necessarily drugs, just put the fibers back into the diet where they used to be and create a healthy microbiota, which now is not hurting you, it is helping you. How much help does it give you? This is the best data that we have from the WHO, which I don't trust, but this study was actually done by good people who I know. We know that if you eat more fiber, it protects you in all kinds of ways. This is very protective. No drug can do this. All the drugs in the pharmacopoeia cannot do this. This is hugely protective. So what are these compounds? They're carbohydrates, but you can't digest them. They go straight into the large intestine where they feed the bacteria. This is phos, a small molecule, so it reacts very quickly. We add larger amounts of inulin, a longer molecule which is slower. We get both of these from artichokes. We add beta-glucans from oats, longer molecule, slower. And we add resistant starch from sources like green banana, a very big molecule, very slow. And you need all those different fibers because when they enter the large intestine, everything is moving. So the short molecules react first, and then the longer ones, and then the longer ones. And in this way, it's like a relay race. We repopulate the entire gut. And when that happens, you start to heal. We used to eat huge amounts of these fibers. They were an important part of our diet, 140 grams a day. And in the Victorians, 40 grams a day. How protective was that? They had no inflammatory bowel disease. They recognized colorectal cancer, but it was rare. Now it's become surprisingly common. Now we're only eating 4 grams of fiber a day. That's how much our intakes have fallen, from 140 to 40 to 4 grams a day. We are starving our good bacteria. And adding good bacteria from yogurt, from Nestle or Danone does nothing. You have to feed your own microbes, then they will look after you. So for the first time, we can create antidotes to the modern diet and lifestyle. This is balance oil, that's Xenobiotic, this is Extend. This you got to do for yourself. Less sugar, less starch, take more exercise. But we don't believe in selling everything to anyone. I don't think that's ethical. Test yourself. See if you need it. If you do a test and you get a good result, we will say congratulations and give you your money back. You don't need us. You'll never hear a pharmaceutical company saying that. This is the point. We're in a position now where we can change healthcare completely. And you're my army. Zinzino think that they're employing me, but they haven't quite worked this out yet. I'm using Zinzino. I want to make the public healthy again. And I can't do it on my own, but you can. So I'm very grateful to you for being here, and I'm really grateful for the help you have given Zinzino in spreading the message. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton.